can't win, you can't break even, and you can't get out of the game. People keep saying things are gonna change, but they look just like they stay the same. You're getting way over your head, and you only got yourself to blame. You can't win, child. Can't break even, can't get out of the game. Yeah.
I'm done with life, and it's all Jermaine's fault. It's always Jermaine's fault. I'm done.
What's up? What's going on, good people? As promised, I'm going to do something a little bit more, something different. It's not as salacious, so I don't expect too many people because it doesn't have anything to do with women. So, but I want to get this in because I think it's important because a lot of people throw around these terms, socialism, capitalism, and whatnot. But Gary Gerstle actually gave a very good lesson on these economic topics, right? And how these political orders actually form around these ideas. So I'm going to do that, and then I got to go check out my son and my little grandson in a bit. So be about maybe a little over an hour. So Adric, as always, if he's number one, then it's going to be a good stream. Andre, what's going on? Tyrone Bixby, what's happening? I'm listening. What's happening? Toya with the apple. I have not seen Demond Wilson, and I heard that he mentioned chaos on this podcast, but everybody wants to send me the whole thing and not give me a timestamp, so I don't want to listen to this whole story. But I'll check it out. Michael Anthony, what's going on? Indigo, what's happening? Titan Blooded, what's happening? Jamal, Trail. Any thoughts on the fresh Taiwan elections? I haven't even heard any results. Really, I haven't really kept up with who the players are, so no, I wouldn't. Sam C, what's happening? Hurricane Greg, Marchand, what's happening? Scorpion Black. One election or the other. Yeah, I think they were. I think they're less pro-American. I think in this election cycle, but we'll see. Yeah, we're doing good, LXD. What's going on? Anybody else singing along with what? Oh, okay. Cool Gamer, what's happening? GD, what's happening? Gundam, what's happening? Cool Man, what's happening? Ice Princess. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yes, it always does. Yeah, it tends that way. It always evens out. Pharaoh, what's happening? LAXT. Some spec on the likes. Yes, sir. Dante Bryant, appreciate you. Detroit 313. What's going on? Louis, what's happening? Hard Buck. More fear porn. It's not really fear porn, it's more information because a lot of people use these ideas and they get them mixed up. Will IR, what's happening? Melanated Caesar, what's happening? Silent Warrior, what's going on? Elliot Randolph, what's happening? Emmanuel, what's happening? Beef King. Charles, what's happening? Black Males, what's going on? Diesel Jr., what's going on? Wunkler, what's happening? Denny, what's going on? Anwar, what's happening? Hey, Travis, what's going on, man? Dr. Thunder, what's happening? That picture, though. Yeah, having to find that one. Want to be Mystic, appreciate you. Paying tuition. J Mar, what's happening? Top Notch Rocker, what's going on? Cutting up with the Joneses. Big Zoe. Alex Shaw, what's happening? Kareem, what's happening, man? As you curses, you California here for the snow. Yeah, it's about 70 degrees here. So Passport LG, what's going on? And Charles Gilmore. Let's see if I can find this real quick because I should have made a cut for it. But since I did not, I will take a chance on a copyright. See if I can find it. Okay, here it is. Here it is. This will do for Martin Luther King. This will do. So you guys can sing along with me. It's a nice little rendition.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Happy
All right. That's Martin Luther King. All right. Let's go ahead and get this cracking. So I found that. I thought that was a decent copyright friendly rendition. So all right, let's get into this. This is a very good book. I had the book. I've read most of the book. Gary Gerstle, The Rise and Fall of Neoliberal Order. But I actually want to kind of go through some of this for about an hour or so because he has to give a really good really good overview of how these political orders are, and he gives a really good overview of the difference between capitalism, socialism, and sometimes a little bit of communism and neoliberalism, which is what we're going through right now. Most people don't actually understand this stuff, so we're actually going to go through this a little bit. Set it at 1.25 to make it a little quicker. And hey, if this is not your thing, hey, and you guys want to check out, hey, I don't mind. Okay, but this is for the people that want to know, and this is for when you actually want to come back and make a reference. Okay, so let's get started.
As we can see, as we move in to another election year, 2024, so much energy and focus gets devoted to the players in the particular election, who they are, what they're saying, as if everything in American politics can be understood within election cycles, 2, 4, or 6 years. The concept of political order was meant to help us understand political developments in America that cannot be understood in 2, 4, and 6 year election cycles.
In fact, that's the problem that we have in here in this space, right? It's 2-year cycles, and everybody's talking about parties and pick a side and all this kind of stuff. And people can wonder how come I don't pick sides. Okay, I don't pick sides because when I say that the right and the left are 2 wings of the same bird, the Democrats and Republicans are 2 wings of the same bird. That's what I mean, and that's why he's explaining. A political order is carries through no matter what party's in.
Cycles, especially in terms of political economy, especially in terms of core ideas of how to build a successful economy. These are ideas that develop over much longer periods of time. And we wanted to understand how that kind of conception of politics could be useful in understanding American society. A political order is a story of a particular political party being very successful at the polls, winning consecutive elections, having a level of organization in terms of lobbyists, interest groups, constituencies, think tanks, an ideology that becomes dominant and paramount. We were interested in understanding how certain kinds of political formations, the one we were studying at the time was the New Deal, became so popular and so dominant that they extended over election cycles and then over decades. The New Deal order was a political formation that arose in the 1930s and dominated American politics until the 1960s. And we wanted to understand how these political formations arise, how they gain and exercise power, and how they fall apart. We did this with the story of the New Deal, which we said was not just a political movement of the 1930s and 40s, but a political formation, a political order that dominated American politics from the 1930s to the 60s. And when I came to write The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, I applied the ideas of political order developed from this earlier book to a subsequent period of time. The neoliberal order I wrote in my book was something that arose in the 1970s and 1980s, acquired dominance in the 1990s and first decade of the 21st century, and then fell apart in the 21st century.
In fact, according to them, we're coming out of what the Ronald Reagan neoliberalism that started in the, basically started with Jimmy Carter in the 70s, actually developed in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, and then carried through up until now. Even I think Biden is the last of this political order. People don't believe that that a Republican like Eisenhower was actually a socialist. Okay, so was Kennedy, so was Johnson, and so was Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president. And it didn't stop until it fell apart in 1971 with the end of Bretton Woods.
At the core of each of these political orders was a certain kind of approach to political economy. Under the New Deal, the core idea was that capitalism left to its own devices was destructive, chaotic, producing too much economic inequality, too much disparity between the rich and the poor in American society, producing a business cycle that no one was very successful at managing in terms of easing out the highs and lows. And the conviction arose amidst the Great Depression of the 1930s that capitalism could no longer be left to its own devices. It had to be managed by a strong federal state in the public interest. What is most interesting to us about the rise of this conviction is that it not only came to dominate the Democratic Party in the 1930s and 40s, but it came to dominate the Republican Party as well. And the true test of this was in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower is running for president on the Republican ticket. There has not been a Republican in the White House for 20 years. You might think that a Republican confronted with a strong federal state built by the New Deal and the Democratic Party to manage capitalism in the public interest, you might have expected a Republican to have dismantled the New Deal, to roll back the big state, to free the private entrepreneurial energies that capitalism can generate. And yet when Eisenhower wins the election in 1952 and comes into office in 1953, he does not dismantle the New Deal. He preserves the welfare state. He preserves Social Security. He preserves taxation rates, the highest marginal taxation rate of 92% on the highest income earners.
And also introduces civil rights. So he actually doubles down on the pro-socialist, or we call Fabian socialist ideal.
The United States. He allows labor, which had gained considerable power, organized labor under the New Deal, to retain its power. He acquiesces, in other words, to the core economic principles of the New Deal. And it is at that moment that the New Deal went from being simply a political movement that had been very successful for several elections into a political order. And the test of a political order is whether
want to be mystic. One thing I can agree with Thomas Sowell, him saying, okay, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. You got to make trade-offs. Free market capitalism comes with trade-offs. Okay. The Chinese are probably about the best balance of government and capitalism right now. Okay, that actually works or currently is working, but it's fraught with all kinds of problems. Okay, there is no such thing as solutions. There's only trade-offs when it comes to something like this, right? What trade-offs are you willing to take?
A set of beliefs about political economy developed by one party become so popular and so dominant that they compel acquiescence by the opposition political party. The Republicans felt in 1952 and 53 that they had no future but to acquiesce to the core principles of the New Deal. When I came to write the story of the rise and triumph of the neoliberal order, the key decade of triumph is not the 1980s when Reagan was president. He was the architect of the neoliberal order. The key decade of triumph occurs in the 1990s, and the question the most interesting questions of the 1990s is similar to the question that confronted Eisenhower in the 1950s. Eisenhower, the first Republican president to come into office in 20 years. Bill Clinton, the first Democratic president to come into office in 12 years. And because the Carter presidency had not been very successful, one has to reach back even further in time to find a successful Democratic presidency. After a furious decade of neoliberal policymaking under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, the question became, will Clinton undo the neoliberal order that Reagan was establishing, or will he acquiesce to its core principles? And the argument in the book is that Clinton acquiesces to the core economic principles of the Reagan Revolution. And at that point, I suggest the very powerful political movement that Reagan led becomes dominant, so dominant that it influences policymaking, not just in the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party as well.
That's why I try to tell a lot of these guys, right? You can't just look at one party or the next, or one little minute policy that they passed, but you had to look at the whole order and the whole direction of the whole order, right? And basically, they try to say that Biden is something that he's not, right? If you look back at what Obama, or hell, Bush's, Obama's, or hell, Clinton's, Bush's, Obama's policies were, okay? Biden is, with a few wrinkles, he's pretty much carrying out the same thing with a few wrinkles.
Clinton acquiesces to the neoliberal principles of the Reagan presidency. And it is at that moment that a political movement becomes a political order, giving it hegemony, power, authority, legitimacy over all of American politics.
Actually, the trade-offs as far as feminism was, feminism, that's a whole different story. Okay, that was before Reagan, about feminism. And the trade-offs as far as college debt is basically they killed the welfare state. Killed the welfare state and had to have something to do with the welfare mothers. So what did they do? They had to send all these women out of the houses and into college, and that's where you get the high college debt. Go back and look at Clinton killing the welfare state in 1996, and then the rise of college tuitions in right thereafter, right until now. They made colleges a for-profit, because instead of having 10% of your population go to college and the rest of the country pay for it, now you have 40-50% of the people going to college. Sometimes even 60% of people go to college. That cannot be paid for by the state, okay?
Essentially then from the 1980s until the second decade of the 21st century. So that is when neoliberalism became not just an ideology, but the ideology that authorized and legitimated a political order that dominated all of American politics.
So one of the things that comes up often in the book is this recognition that the larger social currents, technological, economic, political forces in society are ultimately the primary actors driving events. So you brought up Carter and Clinton. There's perfect examples, because Carter, as you point out, was not, in some ways, he was neoliberal curious. Yeah, he flirted with many of these ideas. He wasn't entirely sure what he was grasping at or what he wanted to focus his policy attention towards, and that may have reflected the fact that these policies, these New Deal policies, were no longer working the way that they were expected to work. And I think even more obviously in the case of Clinton, Clinton came in with, I think, a different set of policy ideas. Of course, he also had Robert Reich as his labor secretary. And then with the electoral loss in 1994, he pivoted and became much more supportive of these types of neoliberal, this sort of, again, I don't know exactly how we would call this neoliberal agenda, or whatever word you want to use for it. In other words, these leaders were, it's not that Clinton or Carter came in and they imposed their will on society. This reflects really the dynamism of American society. And it also comes up for me when we were talking about the New Deal order, which is the New Deal wanted to exercise control over the economy. I'm sure some of that came from the fact that there was a rising interest in managerialism as a result of the Industrial Revolution, but also the fact that it was addressing a cataclysmic depression. And similarly, in the 1990s, there was a sense of government needs to be more distributed. It can't be big. It can't be this lumbering giant. We can't have our hands everywhere. We need spontaneity. Hayek, to quote Friedrich Hayek. So it's interesting, and I just want to point that out, because we oftentimes lose sight of the fact that in an economy, and in a political economy like ours, it's so dynamic, and we oftentimes expect so much from our leaders, but so much of it is really the currents of society. An important question for you about the New Deal order: what was the moral argument?
Want to be mystic, okay? Unless you know this stuff already, unless you know this stuff already, I'd be do more listening than questioning. Okay. Now, if you know this stuff, then you don't need to be here. Okay. Most people don't know this stuff, so I do more listening than questioning. Listen and learn.
And perspective of the New Deal order that legitimized it in the eyes of the people? And how did that differ from what the neoliberal order became?
Well, the New Deal came to power under Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party in 1932, and then again won the re-election in 1936, 1940, and 1944. The Great Depression was the worst economic catastrophe in American history, both in terms of depth and duration. 20 to 25% of the workforce out of work, 1/3 of the people having poor housing, what were called Hoovervilles in all kinds of cities, people making houses out of cardboard or corrugated metal, whatever they could get their hands on, because they could not afford even a minimally decent place to live. And there was a sense that capitalism had failed, and also that a great deal of irrationality was built into the system. Quite a number of farmers found it was more difficult to drive their hogs to market than it was to sell them at market. In other words, they were getting so few pennies on their investments that they decided to kill their hogs. And so you have a situation where all these people are going hungry in cities, and farmers are destroying livestock because they're not getting any revenue for it. And this
That almost happened right after the right after the COVID. Okay. Where farmers couldn't afford to keep raising and feeding their cattle or their livestock, and they start killing them, which causes prices to go up the very next year. And you're actually still kind of reeling from some of these price rises because of farmers not growing crops and not continuing to raise their livestock. So
sense that capitalism had become not just an unequal system, but an irrational system that made no sense. And you needed some kind of institution to come in and humanize capitalism, regulate capitalism in the public interest. The New Dealers were not socialists. They did not want to concentrate all property into the state and run things from the center, but they understood that in order for capitalism to survive, it had to be regulated by a powerful federal state, able to establish a welfare state to cushion the experience of those who were the casualties of the economic system, and also a system that redistributed wealth and power from the rich to the poor, so that many more Americans felt that they would have a stake in the economic system that America had.
which is what socialism was intended to do. That's why uh, uh, what's his name? Bismarck adopted it in Germany in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, he actually adopted socialism or socialism planks the same way America did, and also the UK did it. That's why they brought Marx into the UK, because there were riots, and basically the UK was going through a lot of labor turmoil. So that's how come Engels brought Marx into the UK to kind of humanize the system.
Even during the Great Depression, everyone recognized that capitalism was an extraordinarily powerful system for generating wealth. But the conviction settled in the 30s that it could not distribute wealth to enough people to generate support for this system over the long term. And so the core moral perspective was that capitalism had to be regulated for the sake of giving people a decent opportunity, a decent amount of security, so that they could pursue a good life for themselves, the kind of life that America had always promised its people. In the process of doing this, Roosevelt defined or redefined the meaning of liberalism. Liberalism in the classical sense, if we were to understand it by Adam Smith.
Now listen to it. He's giving you a definition, okay? He's giving you a definition about liberalism, right? We hear this all the time about liberals and liberalism and conservatives, all this kind of bullshit, right? So he's actually going to give you a definition.
The Scottish philosopher and political economist of the 18th century, who was so influential. What he meant by liberalism was removing all the impediments to trade and exchange and enterprise, so people could truck, barter, and exchange as they saw fit. Remove the heavy hand of the monarch, of aristocrats who were not earning their living. Let people just be themselves, free in economic exchange. This was the meaning of liberalism in the 18th and 19th century. And the idea was that if you free people from constraints, they will flourish and they will experience an unprecedented level of freedom and liberty, understood both economically to do the things they wanted to do, and understood politically that they would have a voice in their own governance.
Doesn't it sound a lot like the so-called conservatives, right? That talk about this kind of stuff nowadays, right? Conservatives are not what we call conservatives. They're actually liberals, or classical liberals, okay, which is something that Mearsheimer says the same thing when he talks about liberalism. Classical liberals, and we have to what we call these so-called socialist liberals. A lot of socialists call themselves liberals, right? Or they call socialists liberals. Okay, but the thing is, Fabian socialists are not or liberals, but they're liberals of a different type.
Roosevelt in the 1930s redefines the meaning of liberalism, and so it becomes the synonymous with the New Deal and the Democratic Party. And he says it's no longer enough to make people free from the constraints of government, because if you do that, they're going to become victims of the capitalist system. What he says instead is that it's the job of the federal government to give people enough security, economic security, enough opportunity in terms of education, enough power at the workplace so that they can negotiate decent wages with employers. And the goal of all of this is to get them to the point where they no longer have to worry about every meal, and they no longer have to worry about whether they're going to have enough to support their family. And only under such circumstances of a government-regulated capitalist system will people be able to enjoy their liberty. What is liberty if you don't have any food? What is liberty if you don't have decent housing? What is liberty if you don't have a pension in your old age despite having worked a lifetime? What is liberty in those circumstances? That's nothing but counterfeit liberty. And so Roosevelt says, we're going to make it so people can really enjoy their liberty. And he says, this is the 20th century meaning of liberalism. So it's liberalism no longer means freedom from the state. Liberalism means a state acting to regulate capitalism in the public interest so that many more Americans can enjoy their liberty. This is what liberalism is meant to be. This becomes a moral story. The Roosevelt administration and the New Deal giving a lot of Americans the kind of security, the kind of opportunity, the kind of educational advancement, the kind of rights at the workplace that position them to really cultivate their individuality. This is the 20th century meaning of the word liberalism, liberty.
Which is following Rousseau and the social contract. This is how come I had Dr. Gigi go back and look at the social contract. Okay. And Hobbes also always talked about the Leviathan, with the large state that would actually call balls and strikes and manage this kind of stuff. And Roosevelt developing this big federal government actually regulate these businesses, and people, okay, for the benefit of the people, develop this what we call Leviathan, right? This big federal state.
And freedom. That was at the core of the New Deal story. The neoliberal story is just the opposite. And some of your listeners,
thanks for the taco tax.
Listeners may wondering what is neoliberalism. It literally, neo is just a fancy word for new. It's new liberalism. It's quite similar to the Adam Smith liberalism of the 18th century, but they could not call it liberalism anymore, even though they wanted to, because liberalism was now a term that the Democratic Party and the New Deal.
Okay, well, freedom to live like a slave. What was the under the robber barons? Okay, yeah, what'd you live like? Okay, what'd you live like? You lived like a slave. Okay, go back to the industrial capitalism and the old factories where you worked from 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and got Sunday off. What was that?
Had appropriated. So they call for a new liberalism, and it resonates with 18th century conceptions of liberalism. They looked on American society in the 1970s and 80s, and they saw a very large federal state that was malfunctioning, that was not delivering in terms of economic growth, that was not managing the economy in ways that created sufficient jobs for the Americans who needed them. And so the core ideology and the core moral story that someone like Ronald Reagan tells is that we will make America American again by eliminating this.
America great again, right? America great again. But the thing is, in all honesty, basically, when the when the Bretton Woods system failed in '71. You went off the gold standard. You went through like 12 years of austerity measures, similar to what we're going through right now. So basically, what we're going through right now is similar to what the '70s went through, right? So you had to find another gear. You had to find another way to actually managing people, right? That's when neoliberalism actually came in, okay, under Reagan.
Large state, which is stymieing capitalism, stymieing investment, stymieing innovation. The job of the neoliberals, as they saw it, was to free capitalism from constraints so as to encourage a kind of 18th century style individualism of initiative, innovation, generating new industries, generating new technologies that would create a new economy that would not be hampered by regulations imposed by a large federal state.
In other words, in 1980s, right? Takeovers, deregulation, and there's what did homeboy say? Greed is good, right? That's what you got. Okay, you got the unregulated capitalism. Greed is good. Borrowing money from your Social Security, laying off people, stealing pension plans. Okay, greed is good.
So the goal of neoliberalism becomes to remove the federal state from the economy, to free the animal spirits of capitalism from constraint,
Mm-hmm.
in the hope and expectation that this would bring freedom and liberty to ever larger sections of America. So the core story that the neoliberal order told is really the reverse and the opposite of that which the New Deal order had tried to popularize and for decades succeeded in doing.
So classical liberals were very concerned about concentrated power, but they identified that power in the form of government. In the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, we saw the rise of private concentrations of power. How did the public's and the Roosevelt administration's conception, and the progressive movement writ large conception of concentrated private power inform the moral?
Nixon had no choice. There's a very good book called Gold, Dollars, and Power, right? It talks about why the United States was driven, okay, driven off the gold standard. He had no choice.
Dimensions and the moral arguments for the New Deal order that arose. How important was that, and is that well enough understood today, do you think?
I think the anger at private concentrations of wealth that first emerged in America in the late 19th century, as you suggested, and gathered steam over the first 3 decades of the 20th century, is not something that we fully understand today. Although there is growing anger in the country at the power of large corporations, it still doesn't match the anger that was abroad in American society in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The most powerful argument that was launched in favor of limiting the power of these corporations was rooted in the Constitution of the United States, and the first 3 words, "We the people." This was a country in which the people were meant to be sovereign.
Want to be mystic? Why don't you listen and concentrate, man, instead of talk? Okay.
In which the political institutions of the United States could express the will of the people. And the will of the people, as it was being increasingly expressed in the early 20th century, was that private concentrations of economic power had become so large that the people were no longer in any meaningful way sovereign. They were no longer in charge of their own country, that the Constitution had in some important way been violated, as was the promise in the Declaration of Independence to give people the opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. So the critique of private economic power was couched in patriotic.
They really are classified as socialists. Okay. Bernie Sanders is a New Deal socialist, right? So is what's his name? I'm trying to remember his name now, but AOC. They're all New Deal socialists. They're not the Marxists. Okay, they used to be part of the Soviet Union that doesn't exist anymore. Marxism only really exists in North Korea for the most part. China uses communist, but the thing is, China is not Marxist. Okay, that was given up a long time ago.
Terms that that a country that prided itself on making the people sovereign had to do something to curtail the power of these private institutions that had released themselves from popular control. And this becomes the powerful animating force of populism of the 1890s, of progressivism in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and of the New Deal itself. The language that Roosevelt uses in the 1930s, he calls the private centers of economic wealth malefactors of great wealth. He calls them Tories, a reference to those who remained loyal to Britain in the Revolutionary War. He says we must strip them of their power as the Minutemen stripped the British Empire of power in the 1770s and 1780s. He draws directly on the founding story of the American Republic to drive home the point that this kind of concentration of wealth and power was a kind of tyranny that the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution was meant to eliminate from American life. Now, the tyranny that the revolutionaries were most concerned with was political tyranny. And the modification of that story that Roosevelt makes in the 1930s is to say, we no longer have to fear political tyranny. We have to fear economic tyranny. And our heritage, our founding moment, the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, the war for freedom from Britain, the writing of the Constitution, this can guide us in terms of establishing a republic that eliminates economic tyranny as successfully as America had eliminated political tyranny in the 18th century. And this becomes the story that Roosevelt and the New Dealers tell. They couch it deeply in patriotic terms, that they are standing up for what is best in the American Republic and for its most cherished values and symbols.
Yeah, this conversation about power and the transformation of power, it's how it changes its shape, is something I want to talk about in the second hour when we discuss the new order that's coming into being now and what some of the challenges are that the public is grappling with. But before we do that, I have one more question, which has to do with communism. So communism was a sort of grand ideology.
Now really listen to this, right? Because he's going to go through a very good explanation. One of the most clearest explanation of communism and socialism that I've heard. Probably not the most technical, but probably the clearest explanation that I've heard. So if you understand this, you actually understand what the differences are and what these bases are. Wolf is actually better at the more technical side of it. But the thing is, it's not as clear as Gerstl's explanation.
That attempted to grapple with the forces that we're talking about today of industrialization and the new consumerism in a more sort of from the ground up sort of way. The Bolshevik Revolution was in 1917, and there was a real concern about the appeal of communism in the United States. How did that force, communism, and its success in the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of taking over Russia and turning it into the Soviet Union, and the appeal that political faction of the United States had towards it, the appeal of it, how did that inform the policies of the New Deal and the willingness of the political class to push those types of policies forward?
Well, I treat the communist revolution in Russia in 1917 in the book as arguably the most important event of the 20th century. The conviction at the heart of communism was that capitalism could never be reformed in the public interest, that it could never be made more egalitarian, that it could never redistribute its wealth successfully to broader portions of the population, that it was a recipe and a formula for misery for the masses, deep exploitation. And so the communists said that capitalism had to be eliminated and had to be supplanted by a radically different system in which there would be no more private enterprise, that all economic activity would be run by the state, theoretically by the people, but the wrinkle of communism is that the people weren't ready to manage their own affairs, so they needed a vanguard party, which
is a Leviathan to actually intercede for the people until they could actually get rid of what they call the vagaries of capitalism, and then the state would actually dwindle away. That was the theory. Okay, never quite worked out.
Called the Communist Party to act on the people's behalf, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is how communists themselves defined it in the short term, was justifiable until such a time as ordinary people acquired the requisite consciousness
Mm-hmm.
so as to understand where their true interest lay. Communism also believed that capitalism, being a worldwide system, could not be successfully eliminated unless the cause of communism was made international. It was not enough to establish communism in one or two countries. It had to be a global revolution. And this is what made communism, in the eyes of many Americans, so dangerous, because communism was an existential threat to America. America celebrated capitalism, free enterprise, private initiative, small government, seeing tyranny as emanating from political rather than economic sources. America was the home of the strongest private enterprise system in the world. Communism said that in order for us to triumph, we have to eliminate the capitalist system, which has had its greatest power in America. And the communists had a lot of influence in ways that we have trouble understanding now because of the reasons that we have been discussing earlier in the podcast. That capitalism was generating a lot of inequality, that it was generating a lot of misery, that it was not successfully redistributing a sufficient amount.
Oh, it sounds a lot like what's going on right now, huh? With housing prices and rents and inflation and jobs and all kinds of stuff, right? So, sounds like a recurring theme, does it not?
Of its wealth to a large enough portion of the population. So in the 1930s and 40s, there are many Americans drawn to communism or some version of socialism, believing that perhaps it is true, as the communists claim and as socialists claim, that the capitalist system could not successfully be reformed, that Roosevelt was doomed to failure. And so this is a powerful force in American society in the 1930s and 40s. And then it becomes an even more powerful force after World War II, when much of Europe had been destroyed, where it's clear that the two most powerful countries in the world after World War II are the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is not just a battle between big states. This is a battle between ideologies, because America is the home of capitalism, and the Soviet Union is the home of communism. And the two societies, in terms of ideology, are sworn to each other's destruction. America comes out of World War II, on the one hand, a big winner. Its economy has recovered finally. It has demonstrated a great capacity to produce wealth. It is the only industrial country left standing intact, because so much of the rest of the industrialized world had been destroyed by the conflagrations of World War II. So on the one hand, America is poised to dominate the world. On the other hand, there's the Soviet Union, which had its own feats of production, which had its own heroism associated with World War II, and which is going to many countries emerging from the failing empires of Europe throughout Africa and Asia. And it's saying to them, you will not get a fair shake if you go with the capitalist world. You will only get a fair shake if you go with the communist world. And if you think that America is serious about freedom and liberty, we will ask you this question, we meaning the communists. How does America treat its African American population?
Ooh, here we go.
Those living in the southern states are living in conditions of unfreedom, not that far removed from slavery.
Oh,
100 years earlier. America promises freedom, but it's a counterfeit freedom. You, the peoples of Asia and Africa, you are people of color. You share the hues of color of those in the United States. You see how America treats its people of color. If you opt to go with the so-called free world, you will be signaling a willingness to endure and suffer at the hands of a country that is not just capitalist, but privileges the lives of whites over the lives of non-whites.
ooh, there we go. There we go. And it's worldwide, right? So white supremacy is worldwide. And in the Soviet Union and communists are actually using that against them, right? This is comes right out of Mao's, especially in the 1960s, Mao's three world policy, right? Where the third world, where they said China would actually lead the third world, or what we call the global South right now. Okay, so this revolution started a long time ago, and it died out, and it was reborn in China.
The Soviet Union and communism takes this message to many countries in Asia and Africa. Many of them have communist movements. Many of them have national liberation movements. The the best known in the United States, of course, is Vietnam, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, where America fought a bitter war that it lost. And so the question that arises in the United States is, how do we confront this communist menace? How do we fight for the allegiance of countries in Africa and Asia, where the populations are people of color? And the answer that America increasingly gives is that America has to reform its capitalism. It has to reform its racial practices so as to obviate.
Chill out, Dan Ditso. Okay. Chill out. Okay. We ain't doing that today. All right. Listen and learn. You know, if you want to disagree, you can disagree, but you don't have to do that. All right. Otherwise, we're going to get you out of here.
The worst. And America, both public leadership and private leadership of corporations, become so fearful of communist triumph in the world that they agree to compromise with their antagonists in American society in ways that they might not otherwise have been willing to do. So employers agree to compromise with the labor movement at their workplaces. A serious civil rights movement in the United States gets the kind of support that it would not otherwise have received in the 1940s and 1950s.
In other words, it's called social pressure, right? Not political pressure, but social pressure. Sometimes from the outside, sometimes from the inside, which is something that the ministry has used.
And what I argue in the book is that the pressure exerted by communism on American capitalism and on American policy inclined elites to compromise with their working class antagonists in American society in ways that they would not otherwise have done. They agreed to share a greater portion of their own profits and wealth with the workers in their factories. They agreed to support a social welfare state, pensions for the elderly, help for the disabled, welfare payments for mothers with children without male breadwinners present. The elites in American society are willing to take on these sorts of compromises because they feel they need to do this in order to avert the worst, which for them means communist triumph abroad and, God forbid, communist triumph in the United States.
Well, you know what, Juice? If they're too dumb to actually learn how the world really works, then, you know, God bless them. All right. I don't care what they say. God bless them. If they're too dumb, this is not for the idiots. Okay, this is not for the lowbrow. It's not for low IQ people. Okay, this is something that will explain to you a lot of how these things work. Okay.
States. So communism has a moderating effect on American capitalism, inclining these powerful centers of private power that you referred to earlier, inclines them to compromise with their opponents in American society in ways that they would not otherwise have done. One measure of this is the gap between the rich and the poor in American society. In 1960, a CEO at an American corporation made approximately 20 times what an average manufacturing worker in that enterprise made.
Which still exists in Europe for the most part. I think in Germany, I think the max is 30. Okay. Guess what it is today? He's going to tell you.
20 times more. That's a significant multiple. By 2000, after communism had failed and disappeared from the world, the ratio between the average CEO's salary and the average worker salary has ballooned to 300 to 1.
In other words, you're reverting back to the good old days of capitalism, right?
There's a wage compression between the rich and the poor in the decades of the Cold War that reduces the levels of inequality, economic inequality in American society to their 20th century lows. And this, I suggest, has to do with the fact not just that America had a powerful labor movement, but that elites in American society were willing to compromise because they feared the communist menace. They saw it as an existential threat to the American way of life. And in order to preserve the American way of life, these kinds of compromises had to be made.
In other words, they had to give you a better deal. Okay. Because there was another offer on the table.
By the same token, the failure and the disappearance of communism from the world, and I say that knowing that China still formally considers it itself a communist society, but it's not. It's a Leninist society, and we can, in terms of its authoritarianism, we can return to that theme later if you want to. But it's not communist in any meaningful sense of the word. the disappearance of the communist threat from the world has emboldened these same American elites so as to be much more reluctant than they had been to share their wealth, to share their power with the less fortunate in American society. So the rise of communism and then its subsequent fall has a lot to do with the political story in America that I have to tell. Both the success of the New Deal, when the communist menace was real, and then the success of the neoliberal order once the communist threat had been eliminated from the world.
I love that you brought up compromise. I'm going to stack that right up there with power. And I think those two things go together. And, you know, I this is informed by a sort of Hobbesian state of nature view of what we are attempting.
In other words, listen to him bring up Hobbes, right? Hobbes and the Leviathan, and the Leviathan, which is the father of the state, uh, basically controlling things for the good of the people.
Attempting to constrain with government and attempting to protect ourselves from when it comes to the concentration of power in government. And I think I absolutely do want to talk about how the fall of the Soviet Union informs where we are today because of how it changed the incentives towards compromise, how it informs, in other words, how we've ended up with the political system that we have today, and also the state of our economy. I want to make sure that we get into the conversation about the rise of the neoliberal order. Before we do, I just want to make an observation, and then we'll get into the decline of the New Deal and the origins of the neoliberal order, because those two things happen concurrently. Is it just fair to say, quick question, is it fair to say that LBJ's administration was kind of the apex? It was the crescendo of this order because it involved the Great Society, which was the attempt to really instill in an almost sort of idyllic form the ideas and the aspirations of the New Deal in terms of legislation.
Okay, you know, tomorrow I will actually go over. I actually did this, like, guys, it's got to be almost 10 years ago, right? Which is Feminized America. I'll actually go over that series tomorrow. Okay, talk about why feminism was allowed to rise. Okay, I'll do that tomorrow for you guys.
Economic legislation, civil rights, also something I want to just emphasize in case people didn't notice it. I think what you were suggesting was communism was also an additional incentive. The appeal of communism was an additional incentive to try and address the civil rights issues within the Democratic Party, even though the white South was an important constituency. And in fact, in retrospect, the civil rights compromises on the part of the Democrats cost.
It's a great show. Be great to have more shows like this. Thank you. Okay, yeah, something different other than talking about women all the time. Okay, I know talking about women and in strags and this kind of stuff can be fun, but thing is, I actually wanted to do this because I heard this. I said, okay, this will be good to actually explain to people what these forces and what these terms actually mean.
Than the South, and subsequently led to a Republican administration in '68, and then Vietnam also, which was the sort of all of these things. I guess my point is they are informed by the international competition with the Soviet Union, Vietnam, the outward push against communism, civil rights, the need to find class compromise, and the Great Society to address economic concerns in a way that is sufficient to offset the appeal of communism, so that you don't have to go down that road. Would you generally agree with that? That was the sort of apotheosis of these policies?
Yes, it's the apotheosis of the New Deal order, and also it's when the cracks in the New Deal order become too large to cover up. So it's both apotheosis and overreach.
So talk to me. Let's talk. So talk to us about the origins of the neoliberal order, where these ideas came from, how they came into the margins of society before they went into the mainstream in the late '70s, early '80s, and how that coincided with the decline of the New Deal order in the 1970s, where it became so obvious that it wasn't working.
Well, the neoliberal order, the neoliberal ideas were not new in the 1970s and 80s. The key architects of neoliberalism were Austrian economists like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, who had developed their ideas as early as the 1920s in Vienna and 1930s. They subsequently left Vienna and Austria when the Nazis rose to power, and that became a long period of exile for them in Britain and the United States. And they were diligent about spreading their ideology and acquiring followers, most prominently in an organization they founded that met annually in Switzerland, the Mount Pelerin Society on Mount Pelerin in Switzerland. And so they had annual meetings, and they had a devoted following, and they were particularly strong at a certain number of institutions in Europe and the United States. London School of Economics is one example. In Britain, the University of Chicago in the United States.
University of Chicago, right? Okay. with the what they call Keynesian economics, which is not really Keynes.
But for most of the 1950s and 60s, they were utterly without power and influence. And this included even the man who becomes the most popular banner carrier for neoliberalism, and that is a man by the name of Milton Friedman, who is associated with the Chicago School of Economics and becomes, at a certain point in the 1970s and 80s, a household name in America. But what's interesting about this group of people who want to free capitalism from its constraints, and they want to get rid of strong centralized government because they see nothing good in it and don't believe in the possibility of planning an economy, regulating capitalism. They want to free the animal spirits of capitalism to do its thing. They are incredibly strong believers in free markets, but they have no purchase on politics in the 1950s and 60s when the New Deal order is riding high. And when I talk to young people about this, they actually, and these people tend to be more center left than center right, they actually find inspiration in how dedicated these neoliberal theorists were to staying the course over a long period of time in which they had no influence at all in American politics. And their opportunity comes to move from the margins to the mainstream in the 1970s. And there are several developments that are breaking apart the New Deal order. And I'm very interested in moments when political orders break apart, because in such moments, ideas that were regarded as radical, heterodox, unworkable, consigned to the margins have an opportunity to flow into the mainstream. And that's what happened with neoliberal ideas in the 1970s. The New Deal order is beginning to break up over racial issues, as you suggested, over Vietnam in the 1960s. But then comes the economic crisis of the 1970s, which in my telling of the story is the coup de grace for the New Deal order. And there are two changes in the global economy that really hurt America at this time. One is the reappearance of other countries that are industrial competitors to the United States.
Japan.
After World War II,
Japan,
the US
Germany,
is the only industrial economy in the world left standing after the destruction and carnage of World War II. And it has the world economy pretty much to itself in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It can do what it wants. But the US is also rebuilding Europe. It is rebuilding Japan and other countries in East Asia. And suddenly in the 1970s, Japan and Germany reemerge as very serious competitors to the United States. And American corporations have gotten a little soft in terms of their dominance of the economy. And they thought that conditions of little competition would persist forever. And suddenly they are confronted with these younger, more energetic, more technologically advanced industries in Germany and Japan. Think of automobiles, think of electronics. Those are the two leading sectors. Think of steel manufacture. And suddenly these become serious rivals to the United States, and corporate America is not prepared for these challenges. That rivalry comes from the global North. And then there's the challenge from the global South, because the global economy that the US had rode to preeminence was a cheap energy economy based on the flow of endless amounts of cheap oil, much of it located in the Middle East. And until the 1970s, the flow of oil and the pricing of oil was pretty much controlled by Anglo-American petroleum companies. And increasingly, these countries were getting angry and uneasy about this Western control of their reserves. And there's a Arab-Israeli war in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, where Israel calls on the United States to resupply it with armaments. It is shocked and surprised by the attacks on it by Syria and Egypt in 1973, and feels it can only survive with replenished supplies of armaments from the United States.
Sounds a lot like today, does it not?
States, which the United States agrees to deliver. At which point, Saudi Arabia, in leadership of OPEC, makes its first really successful intervention in the global economy. It simply shuts off oil shipments to the United States. Gasoline prices quadruple overnight. There's not enough oil to go around. America's petroleum economy is grinding to a halt. A compromise is worked out, but the quadrupling of oil prices, which had begun in 1973, persists, and then is given another vast increase in 1978 during the Iranian Revolution and the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, who had been a close American ally and another major supplier of oil. The Iranians hate the United States, the ones who are coming to power. They also shut off the flow of oil to the United States. And so America had gotten used to having no competitors in the world, having endless supplies of cheap energy, and suddenly it has massive competition, and suddenly it's paying a lot more for oil And this plunges the American economy into a long and severe recession in which things that economists said could not happen were happening. For example, the inflation rate and the unemployment rate rising at the same time. There was no explanation for
Remember stagflation. What's going on right now, right? Stagflation, right?
why this was happening. And the tools that the New Deal order economists have been using, a tool of Keynesian formulas after John Maynard Keynes, the great theorist of what federal governments can do to control economies in the public interest, they are no longer working. America is plunged into economic crisis. It's a long crisis. Economists are not being very successful at addressing this crisis. And this is the moment when the neoliberals who are on the margins, who have no purchase, where their critique of a federal government that's become too powerful, too regulatory, does not seem to know what it's doing. This is when their critiques begin to bite. And this is when those voices on the margins saying we must shrink the state, we must free capitalism from its constraints. This is the moment when neoliberalism has an opportunity to rush from the margins.
And that was when Reagan saying it's morning America, right? Remember that? In other words, when they when they got out of the austerity measures in 1983, okay, with Reagan.
Into the mainstream. You said at the beginning of our conversation that Jimmy Carter is a Democrat who ambivalently explores these neoliberal ideas. That's an apt characterization. One day he embraces them, the next day he renounces them. But Ronald Reagan, who's going to be his opponent in the 1980 election, has no doubts about the superiority of free markets, free enterprise, freeing capitalism from the constraints of state tyranny. And when he is elected, this gives neoliberals an opportunity to flow right to the heart of the corridors of power and economic policy in the United States. That's the moment when neoliberalism ascends as a political ideology governing the economics of America.
And that's where I want to take us in the second hour, Dr. Gerstle. The Reagan administration, the fall of the Soviet Union, the political coalition that came together in the 1990s of the interesting bedfellows between the left and the right that led to the compromise of the Clinton administration, Bush and the rise of neoconservatism, and where that folds into the larger neoliberal order, the decline of the order under Obama, and then where we are today. And if we can begin to flesh out some contours of the new order that's emerging today, what can we say about it? Where are the areas that we've already seen consensus, and what are some areas where we can see something coming together so that we can begin to think about what it might look like going forward? For anyone who is new to the podcast, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors.
Okay, we're at an hour, and we made it to the end of this of the video. Really, I may try and see if I can, because the other half of the video is behind a paywall, so I'll try to find that. And tomorrow we'll probably go over the I'll go over my Feminized America series, which actually tell you why they did what they did as far as feminism and neoliberalism. Really not really because of the end of the the end of the pro-socialist Bretton Woods FDR New Deal system. Okay, we'll do that tomorrow. So got to go out and see what my knuckleheads are doing, because my grandson's over here with my grandson and my son are over here, so picking up their stuff. So I'll go out there and holler at them, and I will see you guys tomorrow. So we will talk about feminism and why it came about. In my opinion, why it came about. We'll do that tomorrow. So without further ado, you guys put some spec on my likes, okay? And we'll do this tomorrow. I'm doing this because I actually want you guys to actually be more informed and more educated about these particular systems, and why I am a political agnostic. I don't care about who's in office at one administration over the other, right? Okay, what order does he carry? What kind of system is he going to carry with him? Okay, that's more important than who's a Democrat and who's a Republican, because there's really not that big a difference between Biden and Trump. Okay, there's particular niggling details like NATO. Okay, Trump hates NATO, right? But the thing is, they both are actually in a battle against China, so that didn't change. The reshoring industries didn't change. Okay, Now, how they go about it may differ, but thing is, the policies are pretty much the same. So it's pretty much neoliberalism, even including Trump. Okay, Trump was not a radical. He was not a radical socialist. He was not a radical ideologue. He wasn't. Not as much as you think he was. But anyhow, y'all, I'm gonna get out of here. Soviet Union did fall. It did fall. Economically, it fell, and they knew it was going to fall. In fact, who told me that? Robert McNamara told me back in 1977 that the Soviet Union economically was going to fall. He said 10 years, it happened to be 12. For the class necessary topic that resonates with a lot that we see today, your commentary is also great because historicizes the discussion, which is very important. I just want you guys to be more informed, right? And I want this place to be a key to where you can actually have these discussions and actually talk about these stuff, the real stuff, because this is real stuff. Okay, this who's going to be on the ballot in January 6th, which is important. I'm not going to say that it's not, but these are side issues compared to the big issues that we face. Okay. Anyhow, y'all, let me get out of here. I didn't have a stream. I had a piece where he actually talks about Reagan, and I may do it. We'll see. We'll see how I do it. Okay. Anyhow, yeah, I got to get out of here. So peace out. I'll see you guys tomorrow.